Next speaker up, Jane Gunn, please. Step forward, Jane. Give her a hand. And I can now tell you that we spent some time relocating or finding the missing bottle that somebody thought was garbage. It's actually something that Jane brought with her, and we will soon know why. Jane Gunn is an experienced mediator, one of the leading in the UK, an author. I'll get back to her books, which are for sale out there. Former corporate lawyer. Jane Gunn specializes in transforming business relationships, helping people and organizations to manage challenge and crisis. Jane Gunn has more than 20 years of experience and has mediated hundreds of conflicts and disputes, including businesses, partnerships, disputes within property and construction, personal injury, clinical negligence, and family disputes. She's also trained people in Russian and Finland, and now she's here to give us her insights. Thank you very much for traveling. Thanks for being here, Jane. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. So I'd like you to imagine this. I'm 9 years old, and I'm shopping with my mother. And we're in the basement of the department store, and I'm bored. And my mother says it's time to go now, and so she heads towards the escalator, going up, expecting me to follow. So I walk towards the escalator, and I watch my mother step on the escalator and start going up, and I look at the escalator coming down. Anybody ever done this? And I think, yes, I could beat her to the top. So I'm off, and I'm running up the escalator as fast as I can. Now, I'm only 9 years old. What's going to happen next? What are the options that might happen if you try and run up the escalator? You either make it to the top, or you get carried all the way back down into the basement. So I do make it to the top of the escalator because I'm only 9 years old and I'm very fit. But now, my mother's really cross with me. How do I know that? She's not talking to me. She won't speak to me, and she doesn't speak to me for the whole of the rest of that day. So has that ever happened to you where somebody has just gone quiet, they've stopped speaking to you, or you've had a sense in the pit of your stomach that you've done something or said something which has upset someone? Now, why did I tell you that story? Because we were brought up in a time and a generation of society where it's not okay to say what you think or feel. But, as leaders and as mediators and as lawyers, we have to deal with conflict every single day. And we say now that what we want to do is to build collaboration in our organizations, and we do. And it looks like this. We build brilliant things. We work very well together. If we truly collaborate, what we can build is something great. But what we forget is that we can also do this. We can end up destroying the very thing that we built. So what we need to do is to build more collaboration, true collaboration, into our organizations. Now, there's a paper that came out of Harvard Law School which said, if we want to build collaboration in our organizations, we need to accept, acknowledge, and actively manage conflict. In other words, conflict management is the first and most basic skill that you should incorporate into your organizations. So this afternoon, in a very short time, I want to speak to you about three things. Why does conflict escalate so quickly? Why does conflict escalate so quickly? Why do we not have the skills for resolving conflict? And why we should have a plan for doing that. So I just want to ask you, before I carry on, I want to ask you a few questions, and I want you to be honest with me about the answers, okay? So I want you to put your hand up if your preference is for avoiding dealing with a conflict. So if you're in a situation where you need to have a difficult conversation or you need to handle a conflict, first up, is your automatic reaction to avoid conflict? How many people would say that theirs was? I would say mine was. Yeah, quite a few, but actually probably less than in most audiences, less than in most audiences. So how many of you would say then that you are good at managing conflict? How many would you say that you are good at managing conflict? You have the skills. Again, less than half that would be. And the final question then is how many of you would say that within your organizations, whether you're a law firm or an ordinary organization, whether you're large or small, you actually have a process or a systematic approach for resolving conflict. In other words, everybody in your organization knows the steps. They would know what to do from the very earliest stage of conflict to avoid it escalating. How many would say you have that kind of system in your organizations? One hand I can see. And it's very interesting that I wanted to just talk about conflict as being the magic ingredient in your organizations. And it's interesting that some research from the UK found that most people, the majority of people, instead of managing conflict, would rather jump out of a plane, they would rather eat bush tucker bugs, apparently, or they would rather shave their heads instead of having to manage a conflict. In other words, they would rather avoid it. And some research which I carried out with Birmingham University found that in most organizations, the people who, the first time that people learn about a conflict is when it's been escalated to some formal stage. In other words, there's been some complaint, some litigation, some letter before action. Many people have no prior knowledge of the conflict. In most organizations, the only people who are fully trained in conflict resolution is those that are in the legal department, and in most organizations there is no systematic approach. So there's a big gap, and I think, I couldn't understand all the words that came up on the slide share thing, but I think the word, we don't have enough information, and the sense of ignorance we could do with more information is interesting here. So, let's go back to that. Can we blank that one? Can I go back? Yeah, that's it. Okay. I want to carry out an experiment, and I'd like a volunteer to come up on the stage. So, do I have a volunteer somewhere? Yes. Where's my volunteer? Yes. Oh, would you like to come up? What's your name, please? Ennis? Ennis, please come up. Thank you very much. You don't know what you're volunteering for, so that's even braver. Hey, big break. Sorry? Anya. It's Anya. So Anya, thank you very much. Now, Anya, this is an empty bottle, is that right? Yes. It's empty, so it's completely empty. I'm going to ask you to hold the bottle, Anya, and I'm going to ask you a question about that bottle, okay? So it's a quick question. If you don't know the answer to the question, you're very welcome to ask the audience. I see you haven't brought a phone, so you can't phone a friend, but you're very welcome to ask the audience, okay? Are you ready? Okay, Anya. So the question here is, in the bottom of that bottle are two bacteria, okay? Two bacteria in the bottom of that bottle. You can't see them, they're so small, but they're going to multiply every minute, okay? Multiply every minute, and by midnight, the bottle will be full. So by midnight, the bottle will be full, okay? You've got that, and the bottle's going to be full at midnight, two bacteria in the bottom, and they're going to multiply every minute. So the question is this: at 1 minute to midnight, how full is that bottle? At 1 minute to midnight, how full is the bottle? Don't forget, you can ask a member of the audience.
Well, I think it's pretty full.
You think it's pretty full? Okay. Anybody else got an answer? How full is it? Half full. Absolutely. It's half full. So, Anya, thank you very much. I'd like to give you a copy of my book as a present for coming up. That's really kind of you. And a big round of applause for Anya, please. Thank you so much. Thank you. So the problem is that we don't see what's about to happen. We think when the bottle's only half full, we think we've got plenty of time. We think we've got plenty of time to resolve our dispute. At 1 minute to midnight, it's only half full. At midnight, it's full. And at 1 minute past midnight, you've got two bottles, and so it goes on. So conflict escalates. And that's what I wanted to show you on the flip chart. There's a process called conflict escalation, which an Austrian colleague has described to us. And it goes something like this. What's the first thing that you do when you have a conflict? What did my mother do? She stopped talking to me. She stopped talking to me. So we stop having the conversations we need to have. Then, as some of the other speakers have said, we gather supporters around us. We gather lawyers and teams of advisors. So the next thing we do is we tell our story, and we build a ring fence around that story. So that story becomes watertight. Then we start to issue threats. We're going to serve a writ, or we're going to fire you from the company or something, then actions. And so it goes on. But what's very interesting is at the bottom of the escalator, two things can happen. What's the one thing we're most afraid of in conflict? Anybody? Losing face. It becomes about ego. Sometimes we've forgotten what the conflict was about, and we no longer want to lose face. So, if I tell you about a mediation I've been dealing with recently, which is two senior executives, the first thing they did, which is have something what I call the thin veneer of sociability. In other words, they're still talking to each other at work, but it's really with a false smile on their face. They're not really communicating. They're not talking to each other about the things that really matter. Then you start to have these, what we call parallel conversations. We're talking to other people about what matters. We're not talking to the people that really matter to us. But the final stage of this escalator, the final stage of the escalation process, and we may say this relates to our experience in Brexit as well, is this: the conflict abyss, into the abyss together, because very often you get to the stage where both parties or all parties say, I really don't care anymore if I go down, as long as I take you with me. And so there are two things that we need to do in our organizations, whether we're lawyers to encourage our clients to do that, or whether we're actually running an organization, a business large or small. And that's to have better conversations up here, and also to be able to manage conflict at a much earlier stage by being able to recognize it and have what we call a less adversarial response to it, so have much more constructive dispute resolution processes. So I wanted to talk to you briefly about better conversations. The first thing we should do, now part of the problem for all of us is that we've got one of these. And this is the problem for us because our brain is working away all the time, making assumptions about what things mean. So every conversation that we have, every interaction that we have, whether it's today or with a colleague, whether we get on well with them or whether we don't, our brain is assessing, is that a threat? Do I feel that person is someone that I want to behave adversarially towards? Or is it a benefit? In other words, do I feel that I could collaborate and will collaborate with that person? And I would say that we assess each conversation, each interaction we have on 4 levels. So the first is this, it's about connection. And the connection, the sense of connection means, is this person making me feel less than they are? Are they in some way implying that they are better than me? They have a better case than me, they have better lawyers than me, they are better qualified than me, they're higher up the hierarchy than me. And that sense of making someone feel less than you can make them feel threatened. I'd like to give you an example. When I was training as a lawyer, we have what you call we had then what you call a principal. Now, I was a female lawyer in a very male-dominated firm. I was very junior. My principal was called Malcolm. And in one of the early days, there was a big property meeting. I was a commercial property lawyer, and Malcolm had called together a big meeting. Now, Malcolm said this to me. He said, "You run the meeting, and I'll make the tea." He could have said completely the opposite, and that would have been perfectly okay. I was the junior. So he had the effect of, say, making me want to collaborate, making me want to really work well and work hard and contribute to the firm. The second C, then, is about consideration. We all want to be shown courtesy and respect, and sometimes in the heat of the moment, in the heat of a mediation, we forget to show courtesy and respect. Now, my daughter's a doctor, and to train as a doctor, it's 6 years at university, another 6 years after. So it's a long training. At the end of your 6 years, you take your final exam. Now, the doctor, the professor in one of the universities was setting the paper for the final exam for the students. And he thought he would write a final quote, a final question on the bottom of the paper. So he said to the students, I know that you've been studying in this hospital for 6 years. This is the last exam. When you finish this, you will qualify as doctors. If you do not know the answer to this final question, regardless of whether you've answered all the other questions right, you don't deserve to be a doctor. The final question is this: do you know the first name of the lady who cleans the ward? If you don't know her name, you don't deserve to be a doctor in my hospital. Very interesting. The third C, in this sense of whether we feel collaborative in our conversations, is control. And Bill talked a little bit about control. Do we get a sense that we are in control or not in control? Our brains long to feel that in any interaction, we're not being overpowered by another person. They're not trying to take advantage of us. So anything that we can do in a conversation or anything someone else can do to give us back some control, whether it's in the way they allow us to contribute or the way they treat us, is extremely important in fostering this sense of collaboration. And the final C is caring, because all of us have what I would say is a sort of antennae which says, do I matter and am I heard? And it's very important in all mediations to know that we do matter and that we are heard, and listening to people is a very important skill. But another example I'll give you is that I was, about 3 years ago, talking in a beautiful conference center like this in Krakow in Poland, and I wanted to get a good night's sleep. I was staying in the hotel next door, so I'd said to the hotel, would you put me in a quiet room away from the lift? Yes, that was fine. So I go off to bed, and early night, and boom, 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 the music starts late at night, and I just couldn't believe it. So eventually I gave up, put my earplugs in, I got a bit of sleep. But in the morning, the manager said to me, how is everything? And I said, well, it was actually very noisy, noisier than I expected. And he said, I'm very sorry. And I went off to my conference. Now, when I came back from my conference, in my room, there was a plate of fruit. And this note, and this is the note, the manager had written me, and he'd said, Dear Miss Gunn, we would like to apologize for Loud Night. We promise that Elvis is gone. Smiley face. Michael Kozak. So he showed me in that small thing, small effort, that I really mattered and that he actually had listened to me at that moment. And so would I go back to that hotel? Well, of course I would. So the second thing is then we need to be conscious of our conversations and to be, to be thinking about what kind of conversations are we having every day. And the second thing is this, the adversarial approach. Again, we're dealing with our instinct. Our instinct is to be adversarial. Now, I took part back in 1995 in an inquiry called Tomorrow's Company, which in the UK was looked at the top 25 PLCs, and it said, what do these companies need to do to be tomorrow's company, to succeed in the world tomorrow, to be the best they can possibly be? And one of the key things holding our organizations back from being able to function well in the world tomorrow is the adversarial approach to relationships. Not even conflict itself, but the adversarial approach to relationships. So the two things we need to change are the type of conversations we have and the mindset and the approach that we have. Now, Michael's here and from GE, and many years ago I was inspired by GE. I met Michael, I think we were working out 10 years ago, Michael, didn't we? And I met Michael's colleague who doesn't work at GE anymore, PD Villarreal, a little while before that. And I was so inspired that GE has been a company that has incorporated this approach into their culture. They have said, this is the way we do things around here, and this is the way we're going to manage disputes that come to us, and everybody in our organization will know that that's what happens. And so it's important that we change the mindset and culture. And we've also been looking at, what does this mean for us as lawyers, those of us that still work in law firms? What does that mean for you? Do we have to let go of the advice that we give to our clients, or can we look at this in a different way? And I'm at the moment, as well as mediating, being asked to work with and advise law firms. How can we change our culture so that we can offer a better service to our clients? So I think if you look at how we traditionally have been trained as lawyers, it's to see things in black and white, to see things as positions, to be very conformist, don't rock the boat, let's stick with convention and habit. And that's been quite costly for our clients because we've gone through processes, we've pursued litigation when perhaps a different way would be possible. But here's the new thinking. Maybe we can see things in shades, maybe whatever your color is, we can see, for me it's shades of pink, maybe we can see things in shades of pink. But we need to look more at what are our clients' needs? What service do they need from us? What problems do they need solving? How can we do that? And so whether we're looking at a conflict situation or whether we're helping them to get through resolving problems, whether as a family business, thinking, what do our clients actually need from us? What are the different ways? What are the conscious choices that we can make them have? And how can we add value rather than how can we pursue a process? So again, it's a different mindset for us if we're running law firms as well as if we're running businesses. So what are the lessons here? What lessons does this teach us? The lesson it teaches me, I think, the lesson is that it's too hard to run up the escalator. You can't run up the escalator from the bottom. You're always going to get stuck or get carried down. And all of us are stuck. We're all stuck with a way of doing things, a mindset, a culture that has been drilled into us for many years. So we have to make a conscious choice to change. How do we do that? There has to be a better way. And I'd like to say, imagine if we could change our cultures. Imagine if we could change the conversation. If we could say that making this shift, however small it is, in our organizations is actually one of the most important things that you can do. Imagine what that would mean for better businesses, more effectiveness, how we're going to survive in the future. So I think it's an important shift to think about how can we change our mindset from being more adversarial to being more collaborative? How can we incorporate collaborative experiences into our organizations? So how do you do this? Well, you don't do it by talking about it. And you don't do it only by writing it in your mission statement, though it's important. But you do it. Each of you does it. We can only do it ourselves by being conscious of how we behave, being conscious of how we talk to each other, and incorporating collaboration into what we do every day, into our conversations, into the way we run our businesses. If we take responsibility and we can model what we want to see in other people, imagine how powerful that would be. So really, I think I'd like to say to you, if this resonates with you, if you agree with me, then I would say be that change. Be the change that you would like to see in your organizations. Be the champion. You know, Michael's been a champion, Bill is a champion, and Thomas is a champion. Be the champion. Be the change that you want to see. And then we can all embrace the magic of conflict and celebrate the joy of collaboration. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane Gunn. Thank you so much. We got time now for a conversation, but I need to ask you one thing, because you advise all of us to be less adversarial, more collaborative. But I managed to read, before I came in here, not all of your books, and certainly not all of these two, the Authority Guide to Conflict Resolution and How to Beat Bedlam in the Boardroom and Boredom in the Bedroom. I'm looking forward in particular to this one. But in this one, I also read that conflict is also of the good. It shouldn't be avoided. So could you elaborate a little on this somehow paradoxical complex of issues here, that there is, on the one hand, a need to be less adversarial, on the other hand, you have to embrace conflict as also a force of good?
So conflict is really about diversity. It's about difference. I don't see things the same way as you. I may have a different opinion to you. Is that a bad thing? Should we not acknowledge that, or should we acknowledge that? I love the analogy that a colleague of mine had to say, think about conflict as water. So imagine that you have a garden, Martin, and you don't water it. What happens to your garden?
Well, it will die.
It will die. So imagine that you have too much water, then it will also die because it will be flooded. But conflict is like water in that if you don't have enough of it, you don't have enough to water your garden. So we need this energy of diversity, because if you don't have a different opinion to me, we'll never think about, is there a better way to do something? Could we do something different? Could we move forward? So we have to see conflict as simply an energy and ideas and opportunities that we need to have a conversation about.
So when do you know when a conflict is destructive and has to be resolved, or whether it's a constructive, let's say, piece of diversity?
So it goes back to, how do we have that conversation right at the beginning? Do we manage to have a constructive conversation about how we feel about our differences, or do we slip into this adversarial behavior? And if we do, how do we get ourselves out of that?
Because we had now, I understand that you were not party to the discussions between the two Danish parties up here, the company and the authority, the public utility that had a conflict. But they had an agreement before they even went into this construction process that they would talk about it, they would be less adversarial, and even so, they ended up with a huge pile of claims and conflict and whatnot. So,
and then you have to know, so that's part of having this systematic approach. You have to know, can we talk about this face to face and have a constructive conversation? Or at what stage do we actually need, we still want to have a constructive conversation, but we actually feel the need to have a third person come in and help us?
Do lawyers think in conflict? Are lawyers generally adversarial in their approach? Is that sort of part of the profession?
I think it is, but I think Michael, you were saying the new lawyers are being trained differently. I think we, of a certain generation, have been trained in a particular way to be quite adversarial, to be trained in litigation processes. But I think we have to acknowledge there is a different way.
Can I ask you a question? Is what Jane just said true? Are lawyers of a certain age, let's say beyond 40, generally trained, molded into an adversarial mode of doing business? Or are they generally looking for a way out? Any takers? Please. No, Kurt, you have to wait. You've been up here before. You'll get it in a moment. It's the gentleman right there.
Speaking on behalf of everybody, of course, and not just myself, I can say no.
And why do you say that?
Of course, everybody is schooled in a different way.
Yes.
So we cannot answer a general question like that with a general answer. There are different people who have different interests, different legal backgrounds, different companies, different principles. People are different. There will be old schoolers and new schoolers and those in between. But on a general matter, I don't think much have changed. If you look at the education that you have on becoming a lawyer in Denmark, there is a negotiation for 1 day. There is no mediation. It's not a part of being trained as a lawyer. And that's sad.
And when I trained, we didn't even have negotiation. That wasn't part of the...
No.
Not at all.
And I think we can all say that mediation is for the greater good, and we want to speak politely to each other, and we want to be the change we want to see in the world, but we need to act like it. We need to think of this as not being something that's part of the building society or family law or whatever. This is a different way of doing business.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot more courage than just saying that now we have new rules in the building society, this will all change. Because it won't, unless we act it.
Yes, that's true.
Please, Kurt, Barteleben. And please raise your hands. This is about our own...
Thank you very much.
Please, go on.
I think it's both and there's a long way to go to get home and have more mediation also in Denmark. I have a point of view that is the more specialized the lawyer gets, the more close they become to the conflicts. In the good old days, one lawyer could deal with every kind of cases. Today, you're specialized in environmental law or building law or so forth. And those specialized types are more into the conflict, I think.
Why is that?
If you are very specialized, you feel that you are very wise about this issue, and you are prepared to go the whole way to prove that you're right.
Oh, because you're so smart and so good.
Yes, exactly.
Huh.
And the specialization makes what you call you get a tunnel sight instead of seeing the whole picture.
It's hard to break out of that
yes,
once you...
it is,
yeah,
exactly.
It's this circle up here.
Anybody else? Now, Jane, I want to ask you about... Was there a hand there?
Yeah, 'cause
Oh,
I
a
just
very
want-
discreet hand. Yes,
Yeah.
please.
I just want to say I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I actually think the more specialized, the smaller the circles are, and the more you meet people. And I was just about to say, I'm not trained in Denmark, I'm trained in Ireland and in England. And I think there's a huge difference between, there's a cultural thing as well, like England is big, there's thousands of lawyers. So you don't necessarily meet, and it's, you need a one-up, you need to win. Whereas I'm pretty sure in Denmark as well, but at least in Ireland, it's the same people you meet again and again and again and again. So you have to build consensus, and you have to, at least on the surface of it, be collaborative, because it doesn't work in a very small industry or a very small country. If you're not, you very quickly be unpopular, or nobody wants to deal with you.
It's complex. We talked about this earlier. It depends from what country you come. It depends from what school you went to. It depends what family you were brought up in. There are so many things that contribute to how you see conflict, what your instinctive approach to it is. I was working with a chief executive just last week, and he said to me, I've been married and divorced twice. He said, I never, ever saw anybody deal with conflict in a positive way. I have no role models whatsoever for this. Was his experience.
Please.
Yes, this is on. Sorry. I am a corporate counsel and have also been in the private law firms. I tend to feel that my experience goes towards, and I agree with my neighbor here, that I don't necessarily see the younger generation as being trained, at least in Denmark, dramatically different because they are trained by the older generation, and there is something to the process of you're not really a good lawyer and worth your money if you don't put up a fight for your client. If you reach consensus straight away, if it looks too easy perhaps, that's sometimes the feel you get when you go into it. But I do think as a corporate lawyer, you have the organization behind you, and sometimes it goes towards them saying, we really want to fight for this is a principal matter, but quite soon you start explaining to them the finances of it, and then they're a little bit more eager to collaborate, also for future references. So I think there's definitely room for improvement, and I also think they're ready for it.
Yeah. Thank you.
So what you're saying is as soon as you point to the material benefits, the gains, the possible wins, then collaboration might appear more attractive. You just have to materialize it. Do you recognize that?
I think it is. It's taking this bigger view, isn't it, and looking to see what are some of the benefits of settling earlier. What are some of the things we're not seeing? And as some of my colleagues have said, if you look at what some of the other gains are going to be, what are some of the things you could gain by looking at this in a different way, which isn't just about financial settlement?
Yeah, like we heard in the Danish case, how the mediator and the parties actually made the pie bigger as they were moving on.
Yeah.
Another question to you. You showed us with the bottle, and thanks, Anja, for your help, how conflict escalates at a speed which will often surprise the people involved. And I wonder if you're talking also here large corporations, as we heard from Michael and Bill, these are people who deal with conflicts every day. Is it still surprising to corporations, to lawyers, that conflict escalate?
It's the stage at which it's not being dealt with that's the problem. So before it gets to Michael, or before it gets escalated to the HR department, or before it goes to litigation. So I have had people say to me, this problem's been going on for 3 years before I did something about it, and it's got so bad that... So an example of an organization I worked with recently where a problem's been going on for a long time, they have lost... Something like 5 members of staff have left because of the dispute between 2 other people that had impacted on them before this dispute has been handled by the organisation because it wasn't handled early enough.
But in that early stage of a conflict, you're saying that it can be dealt with through the actions and the way people talk, the culture of the corporation, basically. Does that mean before mediation? You're talking of something else here.
So what you might have is a sort of stage process. So if you were to train everybody in your organization to have better conversation skills, better conflict resolutions and skills, and say, is your responsibility, if you sense that you have a conflict with your team members, to tackle that. And if you can tackle it by having a meeting, by having a face-to-face meeting, or by having somebody within your organization to facilitate that meeting, then it's your responsibility not to escalate it, but to tackle that early.
Right.
If you can't do that for some reason, then the next stage should be very clear, which is we involve maybe somebody senior in our organization. And so you have a step-by-step process that is understood by everybody, that if that stage doesn't work or isn't appropriate, then I go to the next stage. But it's my responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility in the organization to resolve what I identify as a conflict when I become aware of it at the earliest possible stage.
Maybe it would be beneficial to have a mediator in-house.
Yeah. Some organizations do, but yes, an in-house mediator is also a great idea.
In a minute, I'm going to ask Mike and Bill to join us here, but firstly, I want to ask you one final thing. You talking of collaborations and how to be more or less adversarial, but sometimes of course, conflict escalate. And perhaps there are also people involved in this conflict who actually thrive on conflict. There are people like that. And now it's gotten very heated. Mm-hmm. You have a conflict of people who are really angry on both sides. The piles are big, claims are up to here, money involved, huge sums, and egos. Mm-hmm. You have strong CEO there, you have a strong CEO over there. And they basically don't like each other. You have the most awful conflict, and somebody calls you and say, can you mediate? Mm-hmm. Would you say yes? Or do cases get so heated, so out of hand, that mediation is simply not an option?
It's a difficult question to answer, Martin, because I think when you say yes, you probably wouldn't know that all of that background. You wouldn't realize that till you got stuck in, and then you go, my goodness, this is far more heated than I thought. So that's generally what happens, is you get stuck in, and then you say, gosh, this is more complicated than I thought. But nothing is impossible, and I think, there are reasons why people are angry. Sometimes you do have people who really don't want to settle. They want to go into the abyss, and that's their choice. All you can do as a mediator is give them the choice, is open up the opportunity to have a dialogue, even if, and this happens to me often, they don't want to meet. They want to sit in separate rooms, and they never want to meet. They want you to move backwards and forwards and share their messages. If you give them the opportunity, and sometimes the opportunity to be heard, sometimes the anger comes down, sometimes it doesn't, but it's their choice.
Yeah, and you give them the
choice.
The choice. Let's have Michael and Bill up here as well, because I want to ask them exactly the same question and hear what they answer. Jane, why don't you take the seat in the middle? I think that will give us a nice layout up here. Now we will sit down in this fireside chat and have cognac and brandy brought to us in a minute. Perfect. I'm sure. No, it's too early, probably. Thank you, and welcome back to Mike and Bill. Please give them all three a hand while we're at it and while they're moving. Bill, let me give you the exact same answer. You might have already answered, because you said there's basically no type of case, at least, substantially speaking, that was not available for mediation or suited for mediation. But same question to you. Can a case be so heated and basically seemingly out of hand that it is not suited for mediation?
Well, I would say that some people can be sufficiently angered and so on, out of control, that they're not ready for a conversation. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case itself, more about the people who are involved in it, but I'd also say that everybody has... What am I trying to say? I think everybody, given the opportunity to have a conversation, most people, perhaps I should say, not everybody, will surprise themselves at the kind of conversation they're willing to have. So I've had people who say, I'm not going to meet with the guy because, I'll hit him. And fine, okay, we'll keep you apart for a while. But the point has come in a mediation. In fact, I had a case where the two guys had been in business together. They were suing each other because each thought the other was stealing from the business. They hadn't spoken for 2 or 3 years. They refused to meet and everything else. And eventually, I lent on them actually quite hard to meet, because I just had a gut feel it would be important. And they said to me, this will last 30 seconds. And I said, okay, so 30 seconds is better than 0. Let's try. Lasted about 3 hours, that meeting. And during the course of it, after about an hour and a half, one of them picked up the jug of water to refill his glass. And as he did, he caught sight that the other guy's glass was empty. So he filled the other guy's up first and then his, transformed the whole thing. Nothing I did. I just gave them the opportunity to behave in however they chose, and they chose to step up.
The dignity of choice.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mike, what do you think? Does cases get so heated that mediation is out of the question?
it's hard to know before, as Jane pointed out, hard to know before you get there. You know, I think that, you know, I was talking to someone, we had a conversation going at the break. You know, every dispute is going to be different. The parties will be different. You know, you can think, I think an extreme case is one that's used where in a, say, a divorce case, where you have accusations of domestic violence. And you would have, typically be the woman, not always, but be the woman who would be wanting to get away from the marriage. I think the last thing you want to do in that case is to, you know, force the parties to be together, and you have the risk of either perhaps even, you know, imposing upon them out of intimidation, you know, a result that probably she wouldn't out of given choice. You're actually taking away choice by using the process that way, so it would be good to separate it. On the other hand, I had a mediation one time. This was a case in the United States where there's a certain part of the U.S. where there's a tendency to not put the parties together ever, to always have them separated. And the reason is that there's a view that the lawyers tend to pontificate, and it just is a waste of time. You know, you give them this hour or half hour at the beginning, and they give their presentations. It doesn't really do anything, polarizes, and so some mediators, I don't want to have them together at all. I just go back and forth between them. And in this mediation, you said, you know, we're not going to settle this case unless the parties have a chance to talk. It was a Taiwanese company, and I think we were an American / French company, I think, in this case. And our manager, she just needed to be able to talk. And the mediator said, well, I don't think the other side's going to really get any value out of that. I said, why do you think I'm asking for the other side? It's like, I think my party here is the one that needs to have that dialogue. And we were able to reach a resolution after the parties were able to get together. So I guess the answer is you don't really know, but I think it's wrong to go into a mediation with a preconception that it's going to, you know, it's all going to play out a certain way.
There's a question here. Let's bring it in. But I'm interested in this. I want to pursue this because not everybody is rational in the outset. But let's get back to that. In question, please.
Thank you. My name is Frederick. I'm a lawyer. I handle the construction disputes. I think a characteristics of many of the construction cases is that often the choice is often very technical, and it's often kind of a binary choice when you have the question whether or not works are performed correctly, technically correctly or not. And more often than not, there are technical explanations on each side. Each party has his or her own technical advisors pointing either it's correct performance or it's incorrect performance. That might be also technically or, you know, often very complicated. How would you mediate a case like that, where it's the case is on a tipping point and it's a binary choice between one outcome or the other? That's something that is, I think, very common in the cases that we handle as in construction matters. And I would think, from my point of view, that it's a difficult question to mediate.
Thank you very much. Good question.
I've had construction mediations. Actually, we talked about a little bit this last night, and I'm not sure it's the right term to say you weaponize you can weaponize mediation. We had a very large construction dispute in recent years for more than $500 million, and we couldn't get to mediation. It was really one that really needed to settle because there was a big, you know, we sell equipment and technology, so we're not really a construction company, but there's construction as a component of it. But there's a relationship often that will go on for many years. And so you really want to have, if you can, you're going to have conflict, but you have to have a way to manage it and move beyond. They refused mediation. So what we did was, he passed away last year, David Richbell, who was the world-leading expert on construction mediation. He's written a book called Construction Mediation, which won a Cedar Award. So we contacted him and we said, David, will you help us design a negotiation process and think through how the negotiations, because this was to Bill's point, we don't need a mediator, we can just negotiate. So we said, okay, we're going to negotiate. But we negotiated having thought through the entire process with the help of the mediator. Now, I think that we would have gotten a quicker result. It took us a year of negotiations, literally a year from when we proposed to go through this long negotiation process. Because, you know, construction, for those of you who don't know the construction type of claims, they are very technical. Typically, I hate construction litigation because it's like 100 claims. It's all technical. It's fact-based. you know, and it really gives judges and arbitrators an opportunity to split the baby, because they'll say, well, you know, 10 to you, and then, you know, and go away with your dispute. It worked out, I think, very successfully for us to have had the advice of a mediator who's seen these types of cases and would help us think through the process. And we were very happy with the outcome. It just took a long time to get there. I think we would have gotten there much quicker with mediation.
But weaponizing the mediation, bringing in the mediator as part of your own armory.
Exactly. Huh. And that's actually, when you were saying that, you know, you can't have a mediation with only one mediator, I said, well, no, actually you can't.
That's what Bill Kelly called a nice day at the office. You only have one client for your mediation.
I wanted to pick up the same question, if I may, just very briefly. Sorry, mine's gone blank. Thank you. But, so I guess my question would be, what happens to those cases anyway? Forget mediation. Do any of them ever settle? If the answer to that question is yes, then your only question about mediation is, could they settle somehow more efficiently and quickly through managing the negotiation process with a third party? If they never settle because they can't, that's different. If they're inherently capable of it, but just don't very often, then the question is, can you in some way reinforce or turbocharge the negotiation process through using a mediator?
There was one thing that you told me, Jane, before we got here, of a mediator who damaged his legs
Yes.
on his way to a mediation.
Yes.
Could you retell this story? Because I think it says a whole lot about the concept of mediation and how it can be helpful in itself.
So it's interesting. The story, I guess, is about being in the right mindset in the first place and about the process working despite the people. So this is a story of a colleague of mine who was he's a very well-known commercial mediator, and he was going to mediate a dispute, and he arrived at the venue and he had to walk up a gravel drive, and as he walked up the gravel drive he slipped and tore a ligament or tendon in his leg, and they had to take him away in an ambulance to hospital. So the parties had already arrived for the mediation, so they looked at each other and they looked at the mediator and they said, what should we do? And he said, well, feel free if you want to carry on without me, which they did, and they settled the case without the mediator there. So the question is, A, should he charge his fee, or should he return his fee? And the second question was, what was it that enabled them to settle when they hadn't been able to settle before? Because they'd come in the right mindset, they'd come with the right frame of mind, they'd come with the right process, but they were able to carry on without him. And so sometimes, despite our best efforts, it's not about us. And we talked last night when we were at dinner, is that sometimes, even in a mediation, there's a time when we can go back.
Oops, your sound has gone.
Yeah.
No, it's back.
Sometimes there's a time when we can go back as mediators, and the process continues despite our presence. So
I actually heard a story of when it could even happen without one of the parties, and I heard the story of a mediator was caucusing with one of the parties around lunchtime, decided he was going to meet with the other side, came into the room, and there was a note on the table that said, we've gone for a long lunch, increase our offer by $50,000 every half hour until we get back. Apparently he did, and they settled. No, but which says, it says a lot about the process, right? Yes. People come in the mindset, the other side didn't know they weren't there,
But this process, of course, it doesn't happen on its own. As we've already heard, there's lots of preparations in this. So before he got to this accident, walking up the gravel drive, he'd probably met up with these people numerous times.
Well, I happen to know this mediator. For whom I've done some mentoring. So I have sat in on one of his mediators to be, a mentor. So I know that this particular mediator is scrupulous in his preparation. He will have had conversations he doesn't just show up on the day. He will have had conversations with the parties before. He will have asked them various questions. And it's something I'm beginning to do more, even to the extent that I've now got a video that I will send the parties or their lawyers beforehand to say, here's some things I'd like you to think about. Here I am, and here's some things I'd like you to think about and have thought of the answers to before you come to mediation. So
Right.
that in itself can start them off on the right track.
Right. And now we're back to the conceptual issue that you brought up, Mike. Mediation, to most people in this room, will be a familiar term, although I think also that we could probably find at least 5 to 10 different interpretations of the word. How do we arrive at a more profound, easily communicated conceptualizing of mediation so that we can create demand? As we heard, the supply is there are mediators around, there is offers, there is an institution that now promotes mediation, there's even legislation now sort of helping the concept being used, or mediation as such, but there is still a profound, as we saw on the mind mapping here, a profound feeling that the knowledge about mediation, the concept is not really getting through.
Well, I think that this is a question that was asked of me earlier, and I thought about it, and I'm not so sure it's the definition of the mediation, but at the process that you do beforehand that gets you there. And I maybe a better answer to the question that was posed earlier is what we do, and what I try to do when I collaborate internally with the teams, is to do what we call as an early case assessment. An early case assessment, and this is a systemic approach to conflict. So for all disputes over a certain value in dispute, we would ask for, whether it's me or internally, or usually it would be the outside counsel, to lay out, to express the dispute in very honest terms, express it in a way that business people can relate to. So lawyers relate to legal arguments, facts, here's where we're strong, here's where we're weak, etc., and they'll give you a 20-page memo. What a business person wants is something no more than 1 page, the conclusions that say best case, worst case, most likely, and what's it going to cost me, best case, worst case, most likely, and how long will it take. If you can express dispute in commercial terms that the business people can relate to, then the conversation about whether mediation is appropriate or not is an easier conversation to have, because you're looking at, or as the former general counsel I had was from Kentucky, said the business guys want to know, what's the result in 2 years, and can I get there quicker? That's the conversation that you can then have and say, well, maybe it's a form of negotiation, maybe it's a mediation process, but it's now you've got that structure in which to have that conversation.
And what do you think the mediation community, if we regard people in here, there are lots of people here involved in mediation, what should be done from the mediators themselves to, let's say, promote the concept within business?
I think mediators promoting themselves is already promoting mediation. I think promoting your successes. I think one of the things that we often do is, as lawyers, we celebrate the victories. We like red meat. I'm sorry, apologies to the vegans, but we want to have this. We want to eat. And we killed. We have these metaphors which I think are brutal and not particularly helpful. What we ought to be doing more is celebrating the results, celebrating the settlements. It used to be that in some mediators they would actually publish, for example, their cases, their success rates. I thought, wow, that's great. I want to have a mediation with that person because they're getting results.
Yeah, I'd like to invite you to help us reflect on this particular issue, but Bill, could you add something here, and you too, Jane? How does the community as such, the legal profession even, how does one promote and sell the concept of mediation when the concept is not really clearly fleshed out?
Do you want to go first?
I am actually working with a couple of law firms at the moment who want to promote this to their clients, and they not only want to promote the concept of mediation, but they want to promote the concept of conflict management. And so they would like me to work alongside them to say, sometimes we'd like our clients, for example, to learn how to run better meetings. Could you offer your services so we can say, this is something we can offer you to help you manage conflict? And we will, and so they will put on seminars and bring me in and say, let's talk about how we could use mediation. Let's give some examples. So working, alongside businesses and taking that concept in. I work quite a lot with chief executives, so I run like a half-day morning workshop where they learn how to manage conflict, that kind of thing. Just taking the principles into businesses is the thing, something we can do.
Bill?
For me, one of the most compelling things is to hear stories. So, excuse me, today we heard the story of the mediation that was told up here. And I think when you hear that those who took part in the mediation, from both sides and the mediator, talking about how they found it, that's the thing for me that grounds it in other people's experience. Because you can sit there and say, well, yeah, I would feel like that, or, well, I have this kind of conflict, and so on. So the more, okay, within the bounds of confidentiality, but the more those kind of stories get told, the easier it is for people both to understand the process and also to link it to their own experiences.
Please, thank you. And could I ask some of our Swedish friends also to contribute? Is there a particular step forward that needs to be taken in Sweden? Please.
Thank you very much. I would like to contribute in the way that I think we have been talking for 15 or 20 years about how do we convince people to use mediation. And I think there are two things that we need to think about. One is to work on the long-term changing the training that lawyers get at universities. The seeds are made that are totally against the kind of constructive and understanding of dispute resolution that we're talking about here today. So that's on the long term. I think in the short term it's really important to have conversations with people about why they would not like mediation, not telling them why they should like mediation. Because I think that it's not really going to go anywhere. If you look at all the writings that's been done in the Lawyers Association magazine and the Courts magazine for the last 17 years, I've analyzed that. It's all about the big explosion is going to happen around the corner. We need more information out there. We need more information out there to much more disillusion. What are we going to do? And I think we just really need to address the resistance that we are often unwilling to. And I'll exemplify this with a small story from the mid-90s where mediation was introduced in the criminal system. And a person was evaluating this. She was talking to police who did not refer one single case in a whole year. They were having this conversation, it was taped, and they were saying, we just don't understand why mediation is really a great idea. Then she went to the bathroom, came back, and they kept on this, we just don't know what to say. And when she came back to her office and listened to the tape, while she was gone, they were saying, mediation, that's such bullshit. We just don't want that. But she didn't get to talk to them about that, and I think that's a really important point.
Right? Yes, please.
Yeah, that was actually on a previous subject, so maybe you want to...
Go on.
Okay, so coming to your first session, Mike, you said something about, well, you can try mediation, and there's nothing to lose if it's a good mediator. So my name is Benjamin Lundström, by the way, and I'm a mediator, so I'm, very into...
You're a good mediator.
I'm not sure, but I will ask you, so what makes a good mediator? What are the skills and the attributes that you would think would make a successful mediator? Wow. And then I think we have the opportunity for two mediators to, reflect on that as well. Please.
Thank you very much. So two very distinct and succinct points and questions here. Any takers? Let's leave the last one for last.
So which question are you wanting us to answer, Martin?
The promotion, there is the suggestion, of course, of introducing mediation and conflict resolution at a much deeper level at university, at the law schools, and the idea of simply explaining this concept in a much deeper way. Which way do you think that we should go in this particular country, in Sweden as well? Because time is now running, so we need to talk about this transition. We've used this word several times today. What should be put into it?
I think any change in society always meets resistance, doesn't it? So we have to realize that in itself is normal. People will resist changing the way they do things.
But it's been going on for 20 years.
The same in the UK. So, you know, if you look at different things like how long did it take us to change our attitude to understanding the danger of cigarettes, for example, that took generations. It took a long time before people would say, actually, yes, we see that we need to change and we're going to change. And, you know, so there are things, for us as human beings to change the way we do things, even to change a habit takes us many times of practicing. So, for example, they did an experiment, I think, with airline pilots where they made them wear glasses which turned the world upside down. And it took them... They weren't flying at the time. But what they're assessing is how long does it take your brain to see the world in a different way? And you have to keep repeating something. It's even the same if, you know, supposing you decide, I'd love to have better conversations and adopt some of these skills. Well, you're not just going to do it tomorrow. The minute that something happens, you're going to go back to your old way of doing things. So you have to make a conscious choice that you want to change, and then you have to practice that change over and over again before it becomes part of your subconscious and part of your culture and part of your conditioning. So it is a long process. It isn't something we do overnight, but it's a movement, and it's something that we add people to and voices to. And the more those of us who adopt this approach can write about it, blog about it, tell our stories, put on conferences, all of this is what changes the way forward.
Bill?
There are some approaches that have been tried in different countries, either making mediation mandatory, and that's usually a response to the frustration at the lack of take-up. I've got concerns about it personally. Our halfway house that Jort and I were discussing earlier is to make what's called a mandatory information session, so parties have to go along, are required by law to go to a session where they discuss with a mediator what would happen if there was a mediation. That's kind of a way in. I think the other aspect for me is that most of us, and rightly and predictably so, are just involved in our little piece of the world. And so we work in our business, a law firm, an architect practice, whatever it happens to be, and we get on with our stuff. And often what's required to engender changes of this kind is for people not to simply say, well, this is my little world, I've resolved that dispute through somehow, I'll now move on to the next one, but for people to take more of a helicopter view and say, well, what's going on in society at the moment? That's why I linked my final remark when I spoke from here to the fact that we can either learn from conflicts or fail to learn from conflicts. And I know because I spent 2 years mediating a dispute in the national church in England about whether women were allowed to become bishops. And that's kind of a classic, you know, somebody says, well, yes, obviously, and somebody else says, well, no, obviously. And why should we negotiate questions of doctrine and belief and dogma and all the rest of it? The reality is we got there, but the point I'm making is that the institution itself has gone on to learn from that, has taken really, really seriously the opportunity to draw conclusions from what happens. And so one of the delights and the important notions of a meeting like this is for people to step back and up and say, well, what are we, not it's their fault there's no mediation or it's their fault or whatever, but what do we as a society need to learn, and how does that transform into some kind of more national discussion?
By the way, can I say, I heard the response of the audience that people don't think that the new generation coming up is that different in Denmark. And I was going to tell you, I don't agree. I stand by what I said before. I don't know Denmark. I admit that, but I can tell you that the international mediation competitions are chronically oversubscribed. The ICC mediation in Paris, teams around the world. Vienna has a consensual dispute resolution competition. In Florence, where there was zero mediation when I started in 1999, the students imported from the ICC and created their own competition. They thought they would have 20 students the first year they tried this about 5 years ago. They had a cap subscriptions at 120. Now it becomes a biannual competition that they run. I see this all over Europe in particular, that this is changing. So I don't think it matters at the university. I think if you're behind, big deal. The professors aren't with it. This younger generations are going to get it because they're all connected. I had a coffee this morning with Joel Dahlquist, who is a Swede who does this podcast called The Arbitration Station. But he just finished his PhD defense in Stockholm, but he's teaching here in Copenhagen. There's just a mixing of ideas. The train, whatever metaphor you want to use, the train has left the station, the horse is out the gate. It's on its way, it's coming, and this generation will be fine.
And then there was the question. Thank you very much for answering that previous question from very early on. Gert, quickly. We're running out of time.
I'm Gert Nilsson Elvin, business lawyer and mediator from Stockholm. Two things. You put on a cliffhanger, Martin. What could be done in Sweden? And I want to say in the short term, there will be a similar seminar tomorrow with Bill and Mike in the Swedish Parliament. So that is something we could do, and that
not necessarily only for politicians.
Of course not. Mostly not politicians. And the second thing is, Bill, you talked about the complexity and the challenging with cross-border disputes, cross-cultural disputes, and there are a lot of Danes in here, of course, but there are also Swedes. And there are Swedish companies and Danish companies fighting and having disputes. So now comes the question, does it make any sense and meaning by having two mediators, one from Denmark and one from Sweden, in such a dispute?
Bill?
Yes, overwhelmingly. A friend of mine actually just posted on LinkedIn, although with all due respect to the confidentiality of the parties, but he posted a picture of him, this was Jeff Sharp, posted a picture of him and a fellow Singaporean mediator outside a mediation venue in Singapore. They just finished a week of mediating on an international dispute where one party wanted a Mandarin-speaking mediator, the other party wanted an English-speaking mediator, and not only speaking, excuse me, in a linguistic sense, but someone who would really understand the cultural norms and expectations of very different cultures. So they had two of them, and they had a great time and sorted it very nicely.
You want to have the good mediator?
I was just going to say, now we got a few minutes left only before our host of today will say the final words here. But let me phrase it this way. I'd like all three of you to make a final comment by answering that excellent question from before. What makes a good mediator? And let's do it in a row. Bill, if you would start. And make this your final comment of today, okay. if you may.
Okay. I think, I mean, could pick lots of characteristics. I think for me, one of the important ones is what assumption you start with about people. You can either start with the assumption that people are basically going to underperform and they need a lot of help to get things right, and they're probably going to be rude to each other and all the rest of it, in which case you're going to very tightly manage what everybody's saying. You're going to see that you're going to conceive of your role as being to have to extract from everybody some sort of concession because they're too idiotic to see it for themselves. I paraphrase. Or you can say to yourself, fundamentally, most people, given an opportunity, will have a decent go at trying to make some sensible decisions, trying to get things off their chest in a way that can be heard, etc., etc. If you start, for me at least, with that conviction about people, it will influence heavily the way you behave, and because it's an underpinning assumption, and I think that will take you towards a way of mediating that is more likely to produce outcomes, effective outcomes.
Thank you, Bill. Jane, please.
So something that's important for me as a mediator, which I think is important to look for in mediators, is someone who's really prepared to empower the parties, to really give them the opportunity to make a conscious choice, not to try and drive them down a particular route because that's where I think they should settle or because I want to notch up another settlement, but to enable them to really explore with curiosity all the information, to really listen and to make their own choices, so to be what I call self-determining, to make their own conscious choices about the outcome they want from that day, even if that's not to settle on that day, which they usually will afterwards, but empowerment.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Michael, you get the last word.
Well, we have two good mediators here, so I think there's already a good example here. I know they're good mediators. I've read Jane's book, and I've had Bill, actually, as a mediator 4 times, I think, now. And I know he's a good mediator. I didn't select him. We didn't select him all 4 times. I think you were selected off of a list 3 of the times, and I think some was proposed by the other party. The parties felt comfortable with. So I think that's actually a key, to somebody that both parties feel very comfortable with. I think critically, you want somebody who is a mediator. This is a threshold question. There are many people who think that mediation is, oh, I can do that. I'm a lawyer. I'm a judge or a former judge. My mother's a retired judge. When I started, I said, wow, this mediation, I never knew about it when I was practicing in New York. It's great. And she said, I mediate all my disputes. I said, what do you mean you mediate all your disputes? She said, I make the parties settle. I said, I don't think that's mediation, Mom. I think that's just being a judge, you know? But you have a lot of people who think that's what they have a misunderstanding of what mediation is, and those people can do real damage to the parties. So you want to avoid those situations of people who aren't mediators, who hold themselves out. And I think that certification requirements, and Bill mentioned this, increasingly professionalization, to recognize that this is a real skill, it's a real profession, and look for those licensing credentials. The same reason you would not go see a doctor who is not licensed, you shouldn't see a mediator who doesn't have a decent license. And then I think, finally, there's something that you need to make a choice as a party, and that is, what type of disputes do you have? Do you want a mediator who does all their mediations the same? And there's comfort in that because you know that the next mediation will be done like the last one they did. And that's good. There's a certain market for that. Or do you have the construction disputes, things are very crazy, and you really need to get into understanding the dynamics in the parties, and it all has to be customized to the parties. I think you need to make the threshold question. It's not just a question of, is it a good, once you know they are a mediator, are they the right mediator for this particular dispute?
Ladies and gentlemen, help me thank our guests and wish them luck, and thank you for traveling and contributing so heartily today. Thanks very, very much.
Thank you.